Thunderous blares from war horns are heard across the scarred field. Not a day before, the land had been scorched by a raiding group, reducing the town that had once existed here to ash. Now the two armies charge at each other, fire and ash between them. The defenders' men looked in horror as they heard the most terrifying sound, and they knew they would not see tomorrow. And that's when I found out that I was allergic to daisies. Quite dreadful, really, when hiking to the ancient ruins of the Big Rock civilization, but I digress. Oh god, look at the time. I've really got to get on with the lesson. Now today we'll go over the history of the Great North and Guat Henian. You may actually learn something today, since these areas are a bit more obscure than many of the great civilizations we've covered so far. During this time period, these two regions are incredibly dominated by tribes. Rarely is there a strong kingdom, and even then they are incredibly decentralized. Starting in the east, we have a deceptively large Sa'ar Kotsur-an. This entity was a group of many tribes in a loose confederation, with many of these tribes even having evidence of democracy, and some historians have theorized that perhaps they were influenced by the Menkali, or perhaps the other way around. The culture of these people was mainly focused around oral tradition, demonstrated in their main deity, Seb Alder-Ki'ir, which was said to have created reality with its stories. They were most certainly hardy people, able to survive in the extreme temperatures of the northern wastes, and tales from other civilizations describe them as unrelenting forces, unable to be stopped by sickness, cold, or wound. According to archaeological analysis, around the 2400s PH, a hunting party seemed to arrive on Wrangel Island, where it is assumed they came into contact with the archaic species of Mammoths primigenius, commonly known as the woolly mammoth. Now, it may surprise you to hear, due to the relative prevalence in the world today and its prevalence in many world cultures, but during the mid-2000s PH, the woolly mammoth was on the brink of extinction, with their population slowly being limited to only Wrangel Island. It was these Sa'ar tribespeople who are thought to have brought the mammoth back to the continent, and based on what we can tell from archaeological dig sites which are still ongoing today, this tribe initiated a breeding project to grow the population of the mammoths. It was also during this time that the mammoth was bred to be far more identifiable to its modern counterpart, being smaller but more sociable and calm. The reason for developing this breeding program is still hotly debated, and since I talked so long, we don't really have time to go into it. But your task for next time is to write a 5-page essay on why you believe the breeding of the mammoths began. Next we move on to the south, to the Tsatsai culture, a group of tribes known as the Arcunites. It was common for these Arcunites to fight each other for power, tribute, and the brisk grazing land. It's tough to say when the Tsatsai people originally moved into the region, but there are many references to a great leader known as Arkun the Great and his unification of the Tsatsai people. In fact, many tribes and their leaders claim to be descended from the Arkun, which they use as justification for attempts to unify the Tsatsai people. The Tsatsai culture mainly venerated the earth, and there was an idea similar to karma, where the earth would bless those that had done well and punish those that had violated the natural order with natural disasters. In Tsatsai, burning waste was often seen as offerings to the earth, and so you'll often see this culture depicted with bonfires, which they famously created after natural disasters. From around 2200 to 2100 PH, there was an odd period of relative peace in this region. The general consensus among historians was that this was due to the land and population of the region being so ravaged from the wars prior, known as the Hajavari Wars, that the tribes couldn't lead any major invasions. This time of peace allowed for the adoption of the mammoth from the Sa'ar, and for especially significant use in agriculture and new war technologies. After around 2100 though, the population recovered from the Hajavari Wars, and even began to grow past the pre-war population thanks to the new mammoths, and so tension began to grow between the tribes. On top of this, the son of an Arkun ascended to power, controlling the greatest tribe of the region known as the Hiyun. The controversial and provocative actions of this new ascended leader culminated in the collapse of the Hiyun, leaving the region with no clear dominant power, brewing even more tension between tribes. Moving quite a bit further west, we have Incania or Arconia, a hybrid civilization with a weary union between cities and nomads. Incania initially had a strange relationship with the Tsatsai. Both Incania and the Tsatsai came from the Proto-Incanian peoples, who were then distributed across the steppe. Thus, Incania had quite similar customs and religion to the Tsatsai, though it is unknown which civilization developed these ideas first. It's even been suggested that their religion has been influenced by the dung burner culture. Incania had, for around 500 years, a strange power struggle with the Tsatsai, with them being in the form of a personal union, which shifted who was in power over time. After the Tsatsai culture mostly lost all of its unity, however, the Incanian nation had lost its connection with its eastern brother, and its focus turned mostly internally, as a great crop failure began to divide the nation. Due to the famine, the tribal states were unable to sustain themselves, and so began raiding the small decentralized towns to the south. These towns came together under a monarch, and managed to even defeat these tribal armies. Peace was established between Incania and the so-called Oxus Kingdom, with reparations of gold and silver, as well as grazing rights in the southern lands. The tribes that initiated the war were banished from Incania, and had to move south. Finally, we have a group of cultures all deriving from Proto-Indo-European peoples: the Rotor Horde, the Dungburner culture, the Skymaterian Horde, and the La peoples. Firstly, the Rotor Horde, an incredibly ancient tribe which archaeological evidence has proven were some of the first to combine mastery of the wheel with the taming of the horse. The Rotor used this to remain a dominant military force for almost 500 years, demanding tribute from nearby cultures. They, however, were unable to take full advantage of their advanced military technology due to their incredibly strange tradition, migrating in a special and specific pattern, moving in a rough circle motion around their territory, believing that they would be cursed and all die should they deviate from it. Their commitment to this route was their downfall, however, as the Eastern Skymaterians would take advantage of this to completely annihilate the Rotor Horde militarily and culturally, with their cultural practices and religion being forgotten to history until the earliest 20th century, when the traces of their ancient paths were discovered. Speaking of the Skymaterians, they were a confederation of around 23 tribes, which elected a hive chieftain to represent them. Though religious beliefs varied wildly by tribe, generally the Skymaterian religion was based around one main god, Hektadgri, the god of strength, travel, horses, the bow, and leadership. After the destruction of the Rotor, the Skymaterians naturally assumed the role as dominant horde of the region, beginning to exert influence over the various trade routes in the region and demand tribute from neighboring civilizations. The neighboring Dungburner culture had to adapt to protect themselves from the Skymaterian menace. The Dungburner culture was mainly theocratic, their religion a form of animism which worshipped fire, human, and animal spirits. Their small towns were built around large manure-fueled fire pits, hence the contemporary name of the culture. If the fire ever goes out, the whole tribe considers that land to be cursed, and sets out in search of a new locale with suitable spaces for grazing. The southern Dungburners were increasingly influenced by the nearby civilizations of the Ha'alamor and the Bellaria, which increasingly led the southern tribes to become sedentary, while the north became fully nomadic. Despite these differences, the Dungburner tribes, influenced by a particularly charismatic chieftain, formed the Guat Henian Confederation around 2250 PH to protect them from any incursions from the Skymaterians. It would not take long, however, for the cracks to show in the Skymaterian dominance. After a failed incursion into Incania and a massive crop failure, the nation tore itself apart in a brutal civil war, known as the Great Kiran. This civil war finally ended after the High Chieftain was deposed, and his brother signed an armistice with the rebelling 7 eastern tribes. These 7 tribes would eventually form into a commonwealth, known as the Galusian Commonwealth. The Galusians would forsake the ways of the Skymaterians and settle down in a more traditional civilization. The rise of the Galusians would mark the decline of the Skymaterians as a dominant force in the region. The final culture we need to introduce are the La, a loose confederation of tribes with several claimants that occasionally attempted to unify the tribes, as had been previously accomplished under La I very early in La history. They worship an astonishing mixture of gods from different ancient people groups, taking gods from both the Dungburner and Silastare deities. These small La states mainly focus on maintaining good diplomacy with its neighbors and trade. The La so far have been somewhat isolated from the rest of the steppe region, and this was due to their own internal struggles. Around 2320 PH, the La suffered a massive famine which forced the consolidation of the people around the rich Monogekwe River to farm for food. On top of this, a religious shift was occurring due to the La's continuous trade with the Celestara, as the southern La tribes took up the Celestara religion altogether, and although the rest of La maintained their own religion, they were certainly more influenced by their contact. For example, there's tentative evidence that the sun god Dajbog and the moon goddess Devana began to be paired together and slowly became more important, mimicking Soleo and Lumeria's marriages in Celeste. And around 2000 PH, Dajbog replaced Perkunas as king of the gods, and took on aspects which quickly began to closely resemble Celeste. Sorry to interrupt the video, but since I hit 1k subscribers, I'm contractually obligated to do that YouTuber thing now. Did you know that over 80% of my viewers are unsubscribed? To keep up to date with all the crazy videos I have planned, please make sure to subscribe. Also, PS, I have a Discord now. The link to it should be in the description of this video, so if you want to check that out, it'd be greatly appreciated. Back to your regularly scheduled programming. Unfortunately, a great disaster would hit the world around 1900 PH, as there is significant evidence of a massive cold wave, dropping the temperature on average about 2 whole degrees, and lasting until 1720 PH. Documentation of this cold era is found from the Saar to the Yangtze, and even all the way in Islanda. Archaeologists have discovered that this cold wave ironically started with a fire, as it seems a massive forest fire erupted in the north, burning an estimated 12% of the wooded areas in the north. The ash and dust from this fire obscured the sun's warmth, cooling the earth, and leading to many civilizations in the extreme north to migrate southward, constituting an estimated 30% of the Sahara population to migrate out of colder regions and an overall decrease in global population. Not much is known about how this affected the societies, as many that were deeply affected did not have writing technologies at the time. The true effects of this mini ice age are still being uncovered by archaeologists today. Fortunately though, this nation was limited to just western Islanda and continental Taimantal, and didn't affect any nations west of Incania. Just because they hadn't suffered from the cold wave though, doesn't mean they didn't have their own difficulties. Around 1800 PH, a disease spread from horses to humans in what was Skymaterian territory. The disease would be known as sky flu or drowning fever, as it would lead to the infected individual being unable to breathe and eventually to drown in their own blood. This disease rapidly spread through Skymaterian territory, causing a mass exodus of the nation which would spread the disease to other nations. The Skymaterians in the east that survived the plague were too weak to defend themselves, and were mostly assimilated into the nearby Galusians, erasing the Skymaterian culture forever. The plague spread throughout the vital trade routes in the region, infecting the Galusians, Guat Henians, and even the La, which lost a whole tenth of its population in its eastern and western states, and from their trade ports the infection would spread even further afield, but that's a story for another time. With the collapse of the Skymaterians and the development of spoke chariot wheels allowing for the Guat Henian chariots to dominate others in combat, the Guat Henian Confederation finally began looking outward. The key trade route which connected La to the Galusians to Incania and beyond became incredibly prone to banditry with the absence of Skymaterian patrols. The Guat Henians swiftly moved into these regions to take advantage of the trade route. Following this, the Guat Henians would slowly expand, connecting to other key trade routes and securing safety of their pre-existing ones. They even managed to completely dominate the La, either vassalizing them or conquering them outright, a feat which no other horde has yet managed to complete, giving them access to the fertile fields of the Monogekwe River. Their invasion also led to a diaspora of the La peoples, with many of them fleeing north and south, with some even finding their way to the Danube and forming the kingdom of Seratici. All of these Guat Henian gains led to a golden age, with the population of the nation booming and even managing to collapse the Galusian Commonwealth, which was undergoing a period of internal instability. This was one of the largest and wealthiest nations in the entire history of the steppe, lasting for around 100 years, and their grandeur would not be easily forgotten by the nations that came after it. Ironically, it was the Guat Henian massive expansion that made them such a significant nation, even today, that led to their downfall. The more isolated Guat Henian tribes, especially in the newly conquered territories, began to pull away from the Confederation. In response, the dedicated leader of the Guat Henians at that point underwent efforts to centralize the Confederation, with his tribe at the head. This sparked such an outrage within the other tribes that nearly all the other tribes rebelled against this, and after the swift defeat of the Guat Henian's official ruler, the tribes splintered, adopting local cultures and languages, and acting entirely independent from each other, marking the official end of the Guat Henian Confederation in 1659 PH. The rise and collapse of 3 different great nations within 500 years is why the Guat Henian steppe today is known as the birth and death of empires. Moving to Incania, they had slowly been biding their time and developing internal cohesion, with kings slowly centralizing power more over the desperate tribes, honing them to an elite military force, which they used to completely destroy the Ox's kingdom. From there they obtained mammoths from their cousins in Tsatsai, using them for extensive agricultural purposes, allowing for the creation of more cities and the boom of the population for pre-existing ones. These mammoths were not used to the climate of the Incanians, and so a new short-haired variety was bred, which looked quite similar to the Asian elephant. Finally, in 1652, the kings of Incania finally looked back outwards, with their first target the newly independent former Galusian tribes to the north. These tribes only had a meager force, and thus against the newly honed army, along with the first Incanian use of mammoths for war, the tribes were easily destroyed and reorganized into a vassal state known as the Alcaunoms Elkawonum. Their sister culture wouldn't perform as well, however, as the introduction of mammoths into everyday life and warfare led them to hold a strong place in the hearts and minds of the Tsatsai, especially in the southeastern tribes. And though this initially resulted in a mammoth spirit being incorporated into the existing religious canon, a much more radical new religious identity was created centered around the mammoth's role in the creation of the world, known as Tsatsai. These two religions held nearly identical religious values, but the followers of the religion were incredibly distrustful of each other. This was particularly demonstrated in a minor famine that occurred in the 1830s, which led to the two religious groups refusing to trade with each other. The overall crisis increased the tension and discrimination between the two groups, which would spark a much greater conflict. According to the first-hand account of a Yonkwei envoy, some of the southern Sa'ar tribes saw the discrimination occurring within the Tsatsai and thought it, quote, their duty to protect those who are oppressed by their own blood. This, in combination with the mostly mammoth-praising nature of these southern tribes, culminated in a vote for war against the Tsatsai oppressors. In the tribe which the envoy was at the time, there was an astonishing 84% for war, although this claim has been highly debated. And so, the Tsatsai were officially attacked in 1717 PH. The battles across the steppe were fierce, with the Tsai using their disorganized nature to their advantage, often breaking off into smaller squadrons to flank the enemy army. On the other side of the battlefield, Sa'ar soldiers were quick to adapt to the nomadic tactics, and in time even begin to master them. On top of that, unlike their brethren of the frozen wastes up north, they were determined and fought to the last man. Both sides were fairly evenly matched, their strengths and weaknesses countering each other perfectly. However, a large-scale conflict was unsustainable for the Tsai. With food strained even further due to the war effort, the lack of trust between soldiers, and having fewer war mammoths meant that although they could inflict thousands of casualties upon their opponents, and the war was also beginning to strain the Sa'ar food supplies, the Sa'ar only had to wait. Eventually, after many thousands of deaths, 13 representatives from the Tsatsai clans met with the Sa'ar representative to declare peace. In the aftermath of the war, known to the Sa'ar as the Quotsar an Oyov, the Survivors' War, and known to the Tsai as the Tsyokdor Nyatchov, the conquest of Tsyokdor lands, was the creation of a new state for the Tsyokdor, which would join the loose confederation of the Sa'ar. It also forced the creation of several independent states from the Tsatsai lands, which had a majority Tyoken population. This war collapsed the former system of governance in the Tsatsai Arkunates, as former major leaders in the area were overthrown due to poor food management of the general population, leading to a more powerful centralized governance system. With newly expanded populations due to further migrations caused by lack of food, certain Arkunates gained influence throughout the steppe and consolidated lands around them, creating a complex web of competing steppe tribes vying for total control over the ancestral lands of the Tsai. Though the situation may seem good for the Sa'ar, new states were soon going to grow to challenge their control over the region. With that, this is how we leave the Guat Henian steppe in the Great North after this episode. I hope you enjoyed this video. Remember to subscribe to be notified when a new History 2 video comes out. Also remember to like and subscribe for more content like this. I also have some other crazy videos which I think you'll like, one of which is on the screen now. Stay crazy!